Hello there! My name is Dave Baker, and I would like to welcome you to the historic Tuttle Cabin in Pella, Iowa. You may not know this, but the Tuttle Cabin is a very important piece of our history. This is the oldest building in Marion County. When it was built, Marion County looked very different. Pella wasn't here yet. 175 years ago, all of Iowa looked different. Everything past the town of Fairfield was controlled by the Sac and the Fox Native American tribes. Today we roll those in with the Meskwaki. In the 1840s, the U.S. government began working with the territory of Iowa to bring it to statehood. In 1843, a treaty was signed with the Sac and the Fox that opened up more of the land in the state. Much of central and southern Iowa was included in this. The Dragoons patrolled the land because the Native Americans were able to be there until April of 1843. At the end of that month, settlement was allowed by the pioneers. Thomas Tuttle and his wife Nancy were among those original settlers. They came from the town of Fairfield, Iowa, in Jefferson County. When the Tuttles came to Marion County, they had to make claims for their new homes. The boundaries were very primitive at the time, and they had to guard their property against claim jumpers. Claim jumpers were people who would move into their area and claim it as their own, and this happened very often on the frontier. The government wasn't available always to register property right away. Once the government was able to register property, they could collect taxes and generate revenue for the state. On Saturday, May 13, 1843, the Tuttles were able to make their claim. They chose the area that was flat between the two rivers because they thought it would be fertile. This proved to be a very, very good choice for the Tuttle family. The claim included a field, which was about 9 blocks. Every claim had to have a cabin on it. The Tuttles actually built 2 cabins. This one right here that you're looking at today, and there was also another cabin near where the fountain is in Central Park. Walnut logs from a grove north of town were selected, and they were used to build both cabins. There used to be a large sycamore tree in the front yard. Some of your grandparents and great-grandparents might even still remember that tree being there. The great thing about the Tuttles' claim is that it was located on the road that ran from Keokuk to Fairfield and to the brand new community of Fort Des Moines. This meant that they were able to get back and forth to some extent. Some settlers had to rely on water or stagecoach to get between different communities. You have to remember at the time, Iowa was very sparsely populated. It wasn't unusual for homesteaders to have neighbors miles and miles apart. People didn't even know their neighbors sometimes, and sometimes their neighbors would come and they would vacate their property so quickly that settlers wouldn't even get a chance to meet. For the most part, the Tuttles were on their own out in the wild, and there were lots of things to be concerned about. If you think about Iowa weather, it can be pretty unforgiving at times. And they didn't have too long when they moved in before the weather started to turn on them. It got very hot in the summer, and soon it would get very, very cold in the winter. Now, something happened in Iowa in December of that year. When the weather turned colder, in December of 1846, Iowa became the 29th state. When the Tuttles came to Pella, they didn't have much that they brought with them. When they left Fairfield, they had a wagon and some ox. And while they traveled, they slept under the wagon because the wagon was full of their provisions. When they got to Pella, they had to really consider what they were going to do to survive. Planting a garden was one of the most important things that they could do, and they needed to get in quickly because they only had a short period of time for the growing season. What they would use was they would use the oxen to pull the plows, to break up that tough prairie grass and that thick prairie soil, and that was very important. They would also use the oxen to drag the logs from the walnut grove down to where they were going to build their cabins. Now, even though the Native Americans vacated back behind what was called the Red Rock Line, which ran near the trading post that would later become the town of Red Rock and is now today under Lake Red Rock, there were some natives that still remained in the area. Now, some natives did not like the settlers, and others got along with them just fine. In the case of the Tuttles, the natives that lived in their area were particularly friendly with the settlers, and they actually helped them with their growing. And they planted what they called Three Sisters method. And what that was is they would plant their crops in a circle, and they would use the crops to support one another, literally and figuratively. They would make a circle of composted dirt, and then they would fill it full of scraps and compost material, and that would help fertilize the seeds in the middle. And they would plant corn in the middle, and then they would plant climbing beans and squash around the outside. And what happened was the beans would use the corn as a natural trellis. And the large pumpkin and squash leaves would help cover the ground and keep it moist. And that was very important. The plants were able to use one another and extend their growing capabilities. The beans that were planted provided nitrogen, and that was important to help all the crops. Now, one of the other things that the Tuttles took advantage of was the fact that there were abundant bees in Iowa. Because Iowa was native prairie, there were lots and lots of prairie flowers. And so beekeeping was very important. Honey provided sugar and provided sustenance during the winter months, and that was particularly important. Now, at that point in time, anybody could make a claim just about anywhere. And so what Thomas actually did was he went to a tree and carved his initial in it, and that tree became his for the purpose of beekeeping. Much of the harvest that the settlers were able to get ended up having to be preserved for later. Now, they didn't have preservation methods like we have today. They didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have freezers, they didn't even really have canning capabilities yet. And so what they would do is they would dry most of their food. Many settlers had a cellar, and that cellar, sometimes called a root cellar, was deep but not so deep that the crops would freeze. They had to make sure that things weren't going to freeze down there because they didn't have microwaves to thaw things out in the old days. They also had to be able to preserve their meat. They hunted wildlife. Among the things that they were commonly hunting were squirrel and rabbit and deer, which they would make into venison and jerky. And so what they would do to help preserve the meat is they would salt it, but they would also be able in the wintertime to go down to the river and get ice blocks. And they would bring the ice blocks back into town, and they would cover those with straw to make them last as long as possible. Now, when it came to milling the corn, that was a little bit of a challenge for the settlers because there was not a mill close by. They were able to hand grind because the Tuttles were lucky and they had a hand grinder. Now, if they needed to buy supplies, it took them days and days to get to the store. They couldn't run down the street to a Hy-Vee or a Fairway like we do today. They had to rely on communities miles and miles away, which could take many days to get to. For example, the Tuttles, they had their own chickens for eggs, they had cows for milk, and those could be eaten as well, too, if they needed the animals for the protein. They also churned their own butter. They would process their own cream at their home and make their own butter from their milk. Now, at this time, Pella was still not a community. Pella didn't exist yet. And communities are very, very important for trade. Now, if you think about who was needed in the community, there were a variety of different people who were very important in the old days. You needed to have a blacksmith because not everybody was able to repair their own tools or make their own wagons. You needed to have a wagonsmith, somebody that was able to get the materials into town to make the wagons to provide to the blacksmith. You needed to have a harness maker. Brick factories would later be important, and mills were also very, very important to the settlers. At one point in time, Mr. Tuttle had to go to Fairfield to pick up some supplies, and that proved to be a very difficult challenge for him. He had to go 9 days. That was a very, very long time because he didn't have any sort of headlight, he didn't have any sort of automobile to get him there, and the reason he was going was he was picking up staples that they couldn't get easily, things like coffee. They couldn't go down the road to Smoky Row like we do today. They couldn't go over to Yarsma Bakery to buy bread. So when they ran low on flour, they had to go to the next nearest community, which in most cases was Fairfield. Now, one of the things that's very, very interesting to talk about the pioneers is how they took care of their basic necessities at home. And one of the questions that we get asked a lot is how did they do their laundry? That was very interesting because laundry was very primitive as well. Now, they would wash their clothes on Monday and they would iron them on Tuesday. And washing was a very challenging thing for the pioneers because they didn't have detergent or soap like we have today. They relied on things that were around their house. So what they would do is they would use lye soap to wash their clothes. Now, lye soap is interesting, and a lot of people don't know exactly what it is today. But what they would do is they would wait for rainwater to come down onto the ashes from their fireplace or from their stove. And when that rainwater mixed with the ashes, it created kind of an acid. And when that acid was added to rendered animal fat, which they got when they were making lard, they were able to make bars of soap out of it. That soap would foam and it would be used to clean their garments. Now, the water was carried in buckets to the house, and that was a very, very difficult task for the pioneers because the water had to be brought in from off-site in big buckets. Now, 3-gallon buckets were what was considered standard. If you think about water weighing approximately 8 pounds per gallon, you can think about each bucket carrying 24 pounds of water, and that was very, very heavy. Now, once you got the water to the house, then you had to boil it. The reason for that is because clothes wash better in warm water. After you're done boiling the water, then you put the clothes in, and you would use a washboard to scrub them. Once you're done scrubbing, then you would hang the clothes out to dry. Most people had a clothesline, and they would use that. However, some people relied on the tree branches to hang their clothes on. And that could be kind of challenging too, because sometimes you get birds that would perch on your tree branches. Keeping your clothes clean was a little bit more difficult. Birds were sitting on it. Now, ironing clothes was another task that could be quite difficult at times. You had to heat up your iron over the fire, and you didn't want to get that iron too hot because you might burn your clothes, and you didn't want to start a fire with your Sunday best. Now, on Saturday, that was everybody's bath night, so that they would look good for Sunday. And everybody would use the same bath water, which seems crazy to us today. But you have to remember that water was difficult to bring in, so you didn't want to have to go out there and fetch more of it. And everybody would take a bath in birth order. So if you think about it, the baby would be the last one to take a bath, and by that time the water was getting pretty murky. That's why we say don't throw the baby out with the bath water. Now, people only bathed usually during the summer months, sometimes in spring and fall if it was warm enough, but most of the time just summer. And that was because they didn't have a whole lot of consistent heat available, and they didn't want to catch a chill, because if you caught a chill during the winter months or when it was cold out in Iowa, you might get sick. And you have to remember, there was no doctor in town to take care of you when you got sick. And so they didn't want to risk it. It was too risky to bathe during a large portion of the year. Now, even though it was lots and lots of hard work out here on the prairie, people still had fun, and in particular the kids had fun. Young people were able to do a lot of different things, and they were very good at making their own entertainment. For example, many children learned early on how to make their own toys, and they would do easy things, like they would make a spinning top out of a piece of extra wood lying around. Or girls might make dolls from flour bags. Walking, hunting, and fishing were all popular pastimes too, and these were good because not only did the walking give you the exercise, but the hunting and fishing might bring you back some extra food, which was always important. Children often made up games, and they had a lot of competitive fun. One of the things that was very, very common with pioneers was playing marbles. And they didn't have marbles quite like we have today. They would go down and they would make their own marbles out of clay. And that was one advantage of being in the Des Moines River area, is you had a lot of clay available. And clay could be used for a lot of wonderful different things. In addition to using the clay for marbles, you could use the clay to make pots and make crafts. Just like kids today make crafts, kids back then liked to make crafts too. Now, while Thomas was gone to a place like Fairfield to pick up supplies, or while he was out working late, Nancy was often home by herself. And that was a very difficult thing for a frontier wife at the time. Now, Nancy being at home, she had to do all the chores if she was there. And a lot of times, she didn't have a whole lot of companionship. The Tuttles did have a cat, and that did help her out. But she would have to take care of all the livestock animals and bring in the water if she was going to do washing. And that was a lot of hard work for her. Now, the one advantage the Tuttles did have here at the cabin was they had hardwood floors. At a previous residence, the Tuttles did have dirt floors, and so having the wood floors was a significant advantage. Now, they weren't what we think of today as hardwood floors, but they were at least timber floors, and they offered some protection against the element. When Nancy did her cooking, she would do it over an open fire or on the wood-burning stove. She would use great big heavy cast iron pots. Cast iron pots, if you've ever used them, they're very difficult to keep clean once they get dirty. And so what she would do is a lot of times she would make a meal, and she would keep adding to it and just keep it over the fire. That also worked because, again, they didn't have refrigeration and they didn't have microwaves. They couldn't store leftovers like we do today. And so she was reliant on that stew or that chili that she was making and keeping that going all week long sometimes. In addition to things like this, she also made bread. She would make this over the hot coals as well. Now, mail was very challenging also for the settlers. Mail only arrived a few times per month, and it came by horse and rider. There were 3 post offices in Marion County at the time, and Pella was not one of them yet. There was Knoxville, there was the community of Red Rock, and then there was a 3rd rural post office called Elk Grove. Paper and ink were very rare out on the frontier, and they were highly prized and treasured. So people wanted to make sure that if they sent a letter, it got to where it needed to go. So a lot of times they would wait for the carrier to come to them personally. And when they received letters, they were receiving something that they were going to keep for a very long period of time, if they could. So it was very, very important to make sure that they kept their mail safe. Moses Post was a pastor in the area. He was a traveling reverend, and he was also the postmaster. He brought the Tuttles' mail to them. Now, Reverend Post, he went between Fairfield and Fort Des Moines, and so he stopped in the area and brought the Tuttles their mail. When Post saw the farm, he was very, very impressed with it. He was very complimentary towards the Tuttle family. He told them that they'd picked very good land. Now, at the time, there were no schools in the area, and so the children had to learn on site. And sometimes they would meet in small groups informally, but a lot of times they learned at home. Because paper was so rare and was usually used by the adults, they would do most of their schoolwork on slates using chalk, and that way they could wipe it clean and use it over and over again. On Thursday, July 29, 1847, the Tuttles moved to a new farm near Prairie City in Jasper County. Reverend Post came by their farm in Marion County and noticed that they were selling it, and he brought 5 Dutchmen with him from the Netherlands. They were all interested in buying the homestead. They wanted all 9 blocks of the Tuttle land. Now, the Dutch settlers also bought 33 other homesteads around the same time. And the Tuttle farm they were very, very interested in, particularly the leader of the Dutchmen, whose name was Dominee Hendrik Peter Schulte. And the name Schulte probably rings a bell to you. Now, when the Dutchmen approached Tuttle and offered him to buy the farm, they offered to pay with gold, and Tuttles couldn't turn that down. And so what happened was on Thursday, they decided to begin the process of selling their farm. By Saturday, the Dutch folks had come in and had purchased it. On Sunday, they didn't work. That was a day of rest. But by Monday morning, the Dutch had possession of the Tuttle property, and the Tuttles were vacating to Jasper County. Now, the Dutch settlers, in addition to buying this land here that was owned by the Tuttles, and a significant portion of what we consider uptown Pella today, including Central Park, they also bought land down by the Des Moines River, near what we call today Horns Ferry Bridge. And the reason they bought that was they wanted to have good access to the Des Moines River. Now, the original 9 blocks of the Tuttle farm became the city of Pella, and they called it Pella because it was the city of refuge. And there were 700 to 800 Dutch families that came up by steamboat from St. Louis. They landed in Keokuk, and then they came overland to the area that we call Pella today. They were very excited on their trip, but they really didn't know what to expect when they got here. If you really want to know some of the Dutch's impression of the Pella area, you need to read the book Stranger in a Strange Land. It gives a very, very interesting history of Dominee Schulte's family when he came to Pella. When the Dutch arrived here, they discovered there weren't a whole lot of houses in the area. There was the Tuttle cabin, of course, but there wasn't a whole lot of other settlement. And so they decided that they were going to try to build shelter out of earthen homes. What they would do is build these dugouts, and then they would cover them with straw. That's where we get the name Straw Town today. Now, the problem with these is that the Dutch were not accustomed to snakes. And here in Iowa, we get snakes underground sometimes. And they were also damp, and they were cold, and they flooded often, and they just were not very hospitable. Now, the Schulte family, they did live in a cabin. They lived in a cabin near where Central Park is today. And Jan Steenhoek's family lived in the Tuttle cabin at the time. The land claims were a little bit dubious because the Dutch were not yet citizens, and citizens were the only ones technically who could make claims in Iowa at the time. But Reverend Post, he made sure that the Dutch were able to get the claim, and so he helped them out and helped them get the city of Pella started. They plotted it out. 160 acres was what the settlers got apiece. This map here is a copy of the map that hangs in the Tuttle cabin. This shows Pella 22 years later. If you take a look here, if you were to look closely at this or the map that's inside the Tuttle cabin, you would see streets and buildings and the Schulte house, which is still there today. Now, Lincoln Street, where the Tuttle cabin is, was called North Street at the time. And North Street was renamed Lincoln Street after 1865 when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Dominee Schulte and Abraham Lincoln were acquainted with each other and corresponded frequently. As a matter of fact, many people unfortunately feel that Dominee Schulte passed away of a heart attack because of the shock of the Lincoln assassination. Now, the Tuttle cabin is not a very big place, and one of the most interesting places in the cabin is the loft. And the loft served as the bedroom for the entire family. The loft would get very, very cold in the wintertime, and it would get very warm in the summertime. Now, of course, it was a little bit easier for them to handle the heat. If it got terribly cold, however, there were not good ways to heat up the loft space. And what they would do is they would close the door so that the warm air would stay down the living quarters until they were ready to go up. That way it wouldn't escape through the roof. Then, when they got upstairs, they would use rocks that they warmed over the fireplace to keep themselves warm. They would also use lots of quilts. Families had quilts around, usually made out of old clothes. And then, in addition to that, many people would wear a bed cap. A lot of heat is lost through the top of your head, and so a bed cap helps prevent that. The beds themselves were made out of ropes, which supported the mattresses. And the mattresses in the old days could have been made of a variety of materials. Sometimes they would be filled with feather tick. That would make for the softest mattress. If they didn't have that available, sometimes they would use grass or even straw as stuffing. If you were really lucky, you might get a down pillow. A lot of times horsehair was used for pillows and for padding as well. As I said before, quilts were very important. And when they made a quilt, they would often use old clothing. And so they would recycle. And they would recycle clothing probably more than anything else because fabric could be very, very hard to come by, and it had a variety of uses. They could also make rugs out of it. Women took great pride when not doing their housework in doing their quilting and their crocheting and their knitting and also their embroidery. Having extra fabric around could help with many of those activities. Sometimes they would have to spin their own wool into thread, and that was very challenging. So many pioneer families had a spinning wheel at the ready so that they could take the wool from the sheep and spin it. So they could take the wool from the sheep and spin it into the thread. Some women used a loom. They would have a loom in their cabin, and they would use that to weave. Unlike today, a lot of fabrics did not come pre-dyed in those days, meaning you didn't have the variety of colors to choose from like you would today. And so they had to make their own dye to color their fabrics, and they would use a variety of different things that they had handy around the farm. For example, walnut hulls. Those could be used to make a brown dye. Beet juice or raspberry could be used to make red or purple. Cooked cabbage was another thing they would use to do purple as well. As you can see, they used a number of different ways to color their clothing, and that allowed them to have some variety based on what they had on hand. Now, many families had a steamer trunk. The steamer trunk oftentimes had a history, and they would keep family heirlooms in that. Some of the steamer trunks came all the way across the ocean with the immigrants when they came and settled in Iowa. These were very important because a lot of times these were the only places where families had the ability to keep documents and records safe. So much like a lockbox or a safe that we might have in our house today, the steamer trunk helped protect those important documents and papers. Because clothing and material was so hard to come by, you didn't want to spoil your good clothes, and so a lot of people would wear aprons around the house. And they would wear aprons in addition to when they were cooking, but also when they were doing chores out in the yard. And the reason for that is that you could make an apron out of an old rack just like you could a quilt, and that would protect your good clothing. The only place that people really didn't wear the aprons was at church a lot of the time, because that was when you got to wear your good clothes. If you think about the cabin, and you look around the cabin, you'll notice that there is no bathroom. Back in the days when the Tuttles moved to the Pella area, there was no indoor plumbing yet. And so going to the bathroom could present its own unique set of challenges. Many families had an outhouse, and the outhouse was great except at night. Nobody wanted to walk outside at night. You might risk a wild animal or getting lost or tripping and hurting yourself. And so people would actually rely on chamber pots. And the chamber pots allowed them to use the toilet while in the cabin. Now again, because the whole family shared the loft, you didn't get much privacy. But it did mean walking outside when the temperature was 30 degrees below zero and snowing. Up until a few years ago, the cabin did not have any stairs. The stairs were added to help tourists get in and out and to see the loft area. In the old days, the loft would have been accessible by a ladder only. It is our mission here at the Historic Pella Trust to preserve homes for future generations. We want to make sure that Pella's old houses and old buildings are maintained and kept safe so that future generations can enjoy them. It is my hope that someday your children and your grandchildren will be able to enjoy the Tuttle cabin just like you are today. Many of the homes in Pella are built with native materials and employ fine craftsmanship. If you look around town, you'll see a variety of different building styles, but you'll see a number of homes that were very carefully constructed. We want to make sure that these homes last for generations. On behalf of the Historic Pella Trust, thank you for watching this video, and we look forward to seeing you in person.